They say photographs never lie, yet a strange collection of images taken around 1872 raises questions that history rarely wants asked. These photographs show vast, finished cities with grand architecture, but almost no people. Official explanations blame slow cameras and long exposures. Others see something more unsettling, evidence of a civilization already built, already abandoned, and quietly inherited. If Tartaria was only a myth or a misunderstood region, why do these images feel like records of a world paused in mid-breath? This is not a claim of hidden magic or fantasy, but an invitation to examine what these photographs truly show. Mandeville's Lost Imperial Chronicles. The year is 1357. In the Scriptoria of Europe, a manuscript appears that fundamentally alters the Western understanding of the East. To the modern historian, the world of the 14th century is often characterized by isolation and ignorance, a time when the edges of the map were filled with sea monsters and superstition. Yet, the publication of the Travels of Sir John Mandeville suggests a different reality. This text did not merely offer vague rumors of distant lands. It provided a specific, structured account of a global superpower that rivaled the influence of Rome. Sir John Mandeville is frequently dismissed in contemporary academic circles as a fabricator, a weaver of tall tales who compiled the accounts of others into a fictional narrative. However, an analysis of the text reveals a writer who was not inventing a world, but naming one. He introduced the European mind to the concept of Great Tartaria. Crucially, Mandeville made a sharp geopolitical distinction that many later historians would blur. He described the familiar territory of Cathay, or China, as a separate entity from the vast overarching dominion of the Great Khan. This was not a lawless expanse of nomadic tribes wandering the steppe. The manuscript details a highly sophisticated administrative state. Mandeville outlined a realm divided into 12 distinct provinces, effectively functioning as federal states under a central imperial authority. He catalogued specific regions, such as Qasim and Penthexwar, attributing to them a level of political organization that contradicts the narrative of a primitive, unorganized periphery. This was a civilization with borders, governance, and hierarchy. The legitimacy of this political structure is further corroborated by details Mandeville adapted from the earlier diplomatic missions of Giovanni da Pian del Carpine. Serving as a papal ambassador in 1245, Carpine had returned with accounts of the Great Khan's court that emphasized absolute authority. Mandeville's text preserves the descriptions of the Khan's seals, which bore titles asserting universal dominion. By 1357, the European intellectual tradition had firmly established Tartaria as a major global power, possessing courtly splendor that reportedly exceeded that of the monarchs in Paris or London. The most significant, and perhaps most unsettling element of Mandeville's geographical record involves the mountains of Uber. The manuscript describes a colossal mountain range where Alexander the Great was said to have enclosed the tribes of Gog and Magog. While traditional historiography treats this as a conflation of ethnic groups with biblical prophecy, the description serves a more practical function in the context of the Tartarian theory. Mandeville describes a physical barrier so immense that it successfully isolated a massive population from the rest of the Eurasian continent. This was not merely a mythical prison for the enemies of God, but a geographical record of a civilization that developed in separation, physically walled off by the topography of the land. The text presents a world where the Tartars were not just distant, but geologically contained, allowing for the development of a society that operated under completely different parameters than the rest of the known world. Anomalies of the biological realm. If the physical landscape of Tartaria challenged the maps of the era, the biological landscape presented an even greater defiance of modern classification. The Mandeville manuscript outlines a world operating under a different set of biological parameters, detailing entities that suggest either a lost evolutionary branch or a level of biological engineering erased from the record. Consider the vegetable lamb of Scythia. Mandeville documents a zoophyte, the Agnus Scythicus, a tree that ostensibly bore living lambs at the ends of its branches. These creatures were attached by a stem and grazed on the surrounding foliage. Mainstream botanical historians often dismiss this as a confused traveler, trying to describe the cotton plant to an audience unfamiliar with it. Yet, this explanation ignores the specificity of the account. A traveler confusing a textile fiber with a living, grazing animal implies a level of incompetence that contradicts the detailed political observations found elsewhere in the text. To the proponents of the Tartarian theory, this represents a remnant of advanced biological manipulation, a flora that existed before a global environmental shift. The text moves from flora to the fauna of the remote provinces, describing griffins with the bodies of lions and the wings of eagles. These were not merely decorative beasts of heraldry, but were documented as having the physical power to carry off a horse and its rider. While medieval literature is replete with monstrosities, the inclusion of giants in Mandeville's 1357 text bridges the gap between folklore and physical evidence. This presence of a gigantic humanoid population recontextualizes the architectural legacy of the 19th century. Across the globe, from government capitals to the star forts, the scale of construction frequently defies the ergonomic needs of modern humans. Buildings from this era feature 20-foot doors, soaring ceilings, and staircases with risers uncomfortable for an average person. The standard historical narrative attributes this to a desire for grandeur. However, form usually follows function. The sheer impracticality of heating and maintaining such massive voids suggests they were designed for a physically larger occupant. When Mandeville wrote of giants, he may not have been speaking in metaphor, but simply describing the builders who required such monumental entrances. The biological anomalies of the text provide the missing demographic context for the impossible architecture that would later be attributed to the horse and buggy societies of the Victorian age. Maps of a vanished empire. They tell you it was just a region. Modern historians often dismiss Tartaria as a vague geographical placeholder, similar to how we might refer to the Orient or the Midwest. But regions do not have kings. Regions do not have flags. And regions certainly do not have their own dedicated maps in the most prestigious atlases of the Renaissance. To understand the erasure, one must follow the paper trail left by the cartographers who witnessed the empire before it fell. In 1570, Abraham Ortelius published the Times Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the first true modern atlas. He did not label the vast expanse of northern Asia as a lawless void. He titled the map Tartariae Civ Magni Chami, Regni times Tartaria, or the Kingdom of the Great Khan. The use of the word times, regni, asterisk, or kingdom implies a unified political state with a sovereign ruler, a tax base, and a military. It depicts an immense territory stretching from the Caspian Sea all the way to the Pacific. Perhaps most intriguing is the depiction of the Strait of Anian. Ortelius places the North American continent, specifically the coast of California, in startling proximity to Asia. This suggests a world that was far more interconnected than the isolated continents described in standard history books. Nearly a century later, in 1657, the map by Nicolaes Vischer confirms that this was not a temporary anomaly. Nova et accurata totius. Asiae Tabula Times continues to label the majority of the continent as Tartaria. The empire was still intact. However, as we move into the 18th century, the cartography begins to reflect a systematic dismantling of this identity. We stop seeing a unified Great Tartaria and start seeing a fractured landscape. The maps begin to carve the territory into three distinct zones: Muscovite Tartary in the west, falling under Russian influence; Chinese Tartary in the east, absorbed by the Qing dynasty; and independent Tartary, the shrinking remains of the central Khanates. This was not merely a refinement of geographical knowledge. It bears the hallmarks of a rebranding of conquered territory. Just as new management changes the signage on a building, the European powers began to overwrite the name of their rival. By the 19th century, the name Tartaria was almost entirely scrubbed from the record, replaced by the Russian administrative term Siberia. The transition suggests that the fragmentation seen on 18th century maps was the cartographic evidence of a slow, grinding conquest, ending with the total erasure of the previous owner's name from the globe. The silent cities of 1872. Fast forward 500 years. The giants of the Mandeville manuscript are gone. The Khans have vanished from the maps. But the infrastructure remains, and in the year 1872, the camera begins to capture a world that feels hauntingly vacant. This period provides the most compelling visual evidence for the theory: the empty cities phenomenon. When we examine high-resolution photographs of major urban centers from the mid to late 19th century, whether it is Moscow, Paris, Washington, D.C., or San Francisco, we encounter a recurring anomaly. The architecture is massive, ornate, and complete. The streets are broad and paved, yet the cities are deserted. In broad daylight, in the supposed capitals of the industrial world, there is often not a single soul visible. Photographic historians offer a technical explanation for this silence. They cite the limitations of early photography, specifically the daguerreotype and wet plate collodion processes. These methods required long exposure times, sometimes lasting several minutes. The argument is that the hustle and bustle of city life, the moving carriages, the walking pedestrians, simply moved too fast to be recorded on the plate, effectively erasing themselves from the image. However, proponents of the Tartarian theory argue that this explanation does not fully account for the visual data. Even with long exposures, a bustling metropolis should leave ghosts, blurs of motion, or shadowy figures lingering on street corners. Instead, these images often show a crisp, absolute emptiness. It creates the sensation of a found city, suggesting that the populations of the 1870s were not the builders of these metropolises, but merely squatters who had recently moved into the ruins of a post-cataclysmic civilization. This squatter narrative is reinforced by the mud flood hypothesis. Adherents point to the ubiquitous buried windows, architectural features where the ground floor of a building appears to be half submerged in the earth. Traditional architects dismiss these as light wells or daylight basements designed for ventilation. But the alternative historian asks a simpler question: why would anyone construct a window that stares directly into a wall of dirt? The mud flood theory posits that a global cataclysm, occurring sometime in the mid-19th century, buried the lower levels of these structures in meters of soil. The basements we see today were arguably the original first floors, now swallowed by the earth, leaving the new inhabitants to simply pave over the disaster and claim the upper levels as their own. How to hide an empire? If a civilization as vast as Tartaria truly existed, the question of its disappearance becomes the central mystery. How do you erase a global superpower? The theory suggests a brutal two-step mechanism. First, you burn the evidence, and then you explain away the ruins. The late 19th century is remembered as the era of the Great Fires: Chicago in 1871, Boston in 1872, and San Francisco in 1906. Mainstream history attributes these catastrophes to simple accidents, like a cow kicking over a lantern or an unfortunate earthquake. However, the physical descriptions of the aftermath often defy the physics of a standard timber fire. Contemporary reports describe stone and brick melting into glass, indicating temperatures far exceeding what a wood-fueled blaze should produce. To proponents of the theory, these were not accidents. They were calculated acts of demolition, likely using advanced incendiaries to wipe out the existing Tartarian infrastructure that was too distinct to be repurposed. Once the cities were purged, the remaining architecture had to be accounted for. This brings us to the World's Fairs, specifically the Chicago Columbian Exposition of 1893 and the San Francisco Panama Pacific International Exposition of 1915. We are told these sprawling neoclassical cities were built in mere months using staff, a temporary mixture of plaster and hemp. They were disposable wonders, designed to be demolished as soon as the fair closed. But the photographic record shows buildings of immense scale and engineering precision that suggest permanence. The Tartarian theory posits that these were not built for the fair. They were the found remnants of the old empire. The World's Fair served as an exit ceremony. It was a clever psychological trick. Open the ancient cities to the public, claim they were temporary artistic creations, and then demolish them in plain sight. The erasure continues in the archives. The Russian Geographical Society currently sits at the center of this paradox. They actively display the historical maps labeled Grand Tartary, confirming the name was once standard. Yet they vigorously reject the notion of a lost civilization, framing it as a misunderstanding of historical nomenclature. The result is a history that has been physically incinerated in the West and academically sanitized in the East. Architecture of the lost grid. Look at the skyline of any major city built before the 20th century. Focus on the roofs. To the untrained eye, the spires, domes, and intricate metal finials appear to be mere religious ornamentation or stylistic flourishes. But the Antiquitech hypothesis suggests a radically different purpose. Those aren't crosses, they are antennas. This theory challenges us to reconcile a glaring visual contradiction found in the 1872 photographic record. In the foreground, we see a society operating at the speed of a horse. The streets are unpaved mud, the vehicles are wooden wagons, and the lighting is gas or candle. Yet, looming in the background are structures of electromagnetic perfection, cathedrals and capitol buildings, with geometry so precise and materials so conductive that they resemble circuit boards more than places of worship. It strains credulity to believe that a civilization struggling to pave its roads possessed the logistical capacity to construct a global network of resonant power stations. The core of the Antiquitech concept is that these buildings were functional machines designed to harvest atmospheric electricity. The domes served as capacitors, the spires as conductors, and the metal finials as contact points for the etheric energy present in the atmosphere. This was a wireless grid, providing free, clean power to the inhabitants. Even the building materials played a role. Proponents point to the omnipresent red brick used in Victorian industrial architecture. These bricks are rich in iron oxide, a compound that, under specific conditions, can act as an electrical insulator or a conductor. The theory posits that these massive masonry piles were essentially batteries, capable of storing and conducting thermal or electromagnetic energy. The dismantling of this system was likely the final step of the Great Reset. When the previous civilization was erased, the new managers of the estate had to disable the power source to ensure control. We are told that bells were melted down for war, and that mercury was removed for safety. However, the removal of these specific components, bells for resonance and mercury for amplification, effectively deactivated the grid. The free energy spires were rebranded as religious symbols, and the population was transitioned to a reliance on primitive, metered fossil fuels. The electromagnetic cathedrals remained, but their plugs were pulled, leaving them as hollow shells of a forgotten technology, reshaping the physical world. If they lied about the people, did they lie about the ground they walked on? The anomalies of Tartaria are not limited to politics and architecture. They extend to the very geography of the Eurasian continent. When we overlay the maps of the 16th and 17th centuries onto modern satellite imagery, the discrepancies are often too vast to be dismissed as mere cartographic error. We are faced with two possibilities. Either the Renaissance mapmakers were far less competent than we give them credit for, or the physical shape of the world has undergone a radical transformation. Consider the Caspian Sea. In modern geography, it is an enclosed body of water, strictly landlocked. Yet, in numerous maps of Great Tartaria, the Caspian is depicted with a vastly different geometry. It is frequently shown connected to the Aral Sea, or even possessing a northern waterway linking it directly to the Arctic Ocean. Geologists attribute this to the slow desiccation of the Central Asian basin over thousands of years. However, the Tartarian theory compresses this timeline. It suggests that the topographical shift did not happen over millennia, but rapidly, perhaps as recently as the mid-19th century. This aligns with the mud flood hypothesis, proposing that a massive influx of soil and water reshaped the drainage basins of the continent, severing ancient waterways and isolating the Caspian as we know it today. The questions deepen when we look to the Pacific coast. The 1,570 Ortelius map, so precise in other areas, is missing massive landforms. The Korean Peninsula and the Kamchatka Peninsula are notably absent or unrecognizable. Traditional historians argue this simply represents the limit of European exploration, that the mapmakers were filling in the blanks with guesswork. But the alternative perspective offers a more disturbing conclusion. Perhaps those lands were not yet there. If the mud flood involved a global shift in water levels and landmass stability, it is conceivable that these peninsulas emerged or were deposited after the waters receded. The mapmakers may have been accurately recording a world that no longer exists, a geography that was physically rewritten by the same cataclysm that erased the empire itself. Fragmentation of a unified identity. Or maybe we are just looking at it wrong. Maybe the people of Tartaria were not erased in a flash of fire, but rather through the slow, bureaucratic process of reclassification. The debate between the accepted history and the Tartarian theory ultimately hinges on how we define a civilization. Standard academia presents a grounded, robust framework known as the Scythian-Turkic continuity. Historians argue that the Tartars were never a single, monolithic empire, but rather a mosaic of diverse, nomadic peoples inhabiting the Eurasian steppe. They point to the tangible evidence of cultural survival: the felt trousers, the distinctive tall caps, and the wagon houses, or yurts, that have been used from the Scythians of the pre-Christian era all the way to the Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire. To the academic, this continuity proves that the people were well documented, not hidden. However, the Tartarian theorist views this same evidence through a darker lens. They argue that this emphasis on diversity and tribalism is the very mechanism of the erasure. By taking a massive, unified population and linguistically slicing them into smaller subgroups, Mongols, Turks, Manchus, Siberians, historians effectively fractured the identity of the empire. It is a divide-and-conquer strategy applied to the history books. If you label a group as Mongol invaders here and Ottoman Turks there, you successfully obscure the possibility that they were part of a larger, cohesive Tartarian superstructure. The linguistic shift serves to downgrade a potential superpower into a collection of scattered, unrelated tribes. In this narrative, the erasure was not physical, but semantic. The empire didn't fall. It was simply renamed piece by piece until the original title of Grand Tartary referred to nothing but a ghost on an old map. A world of forgotten giants. So, why does this matter? Why are millions of people obsessed with a map from 1357 and a blurry photograph from 1872? The theory of the Tartarian Empire is dismissed by mainstream academia as a fantasy, yet it refuses to die. This is because it is not merely a debate about geography or dates. It is a debate about human capability and the feeling that we have lost something vital. The photographs of 1872 serve as a cultural Rorschach test. When an architectural historian looks at a picture of the Capitol building or a massive Beaux Arts library, they see the triumph of the industrial age. They see the grit, labor, and neoclassical ambition of a young society. But when a proponent of the Tartarian theory looks at the same image, they see a crime scene. They see a legacy that was stolen. They see a civilization of impossible grandeur that was inherited by a society that could barely pave the streets in front of it. This sense of displacement is nowhere more poignant than in the narrative of the orphan trains. Between 1800 1854 and 1929, hundreds of thousands of children were transported from the crowded cities of the East to the rural Midwest. In the official history, this was a charitable labor movement. In the Tartarian framework, this was the repopulation. These children are viewed as the inheritors of the empty cities we observed in Chapter 4, a generation raised in state-run institutions, disconnected from their true lineage, and educated to believe the official timeline. They were the blank slates upon which the new history was written, the unwitting squatters in the ruins of the giants. We have traveled from the 1357 manuscript of Sir John Mandeville, who first named the empire and described its biological wonders, to the maps of Ortelius that defined its borders. We have scrutinized the great fires that burned the evidence and the world's fairs that allegedly mocked the technology before destroying it. The 1872 photographic corpus stands as the final, silent witness to this transition. It captures the moment the old world stood still, just before the machinery of the modern age began to turn.